Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna with today's discussion. The British High Street faces extinction. The retail expert and government advisor Mary Portas warned that the High Street could vanish forever unless urgent action is taken. Her report found that across the UK, 20 shops are closing every day, with 1 in 7 shops vacant. As the recession deepens, high streets across the UK are under increasing pressure. At the same time, the trade body, the British Retail Consortium, says the value of internet retail sales in 2011 was up to £27 billion. So is the high street dead, and are more people turning to the internet to get better value for money? Joining me to discuss this is Richard Dodd from the British Retail Consortium, retail consultant Brian Moore, and David Boyle from the New Economics Foundation. Is the high street shopping a thing of the past?
No, not in any sense. You just said, is it dead? Well, it's absolutely not dead. It's still alive. You know, you could say, is it alive and well? Certainly it's got some difficulties in many parts of the UK, but close to half of all spending is still done in high streets. So it's a very important part of the overall retail picture. And of course, high streets are very, very important to local communities and local economies in terms of services and jobs that they provide.
What do you think, Graham?
I agree. I would stop short of saying dead. It's dying unless we do something serious about it. And that is a question of what cause and effect, and also how we treat it, and there are political, social and other overrides to that. But basically, it's in serious need of help. It's under enormous threat. We all want to keep it healthy, if you like, but we need to do certain things about it, which will no doubt come out later on in conversation.
And David Boyle from the New Economics Foundation?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said. That's not to say there are no problems with the high street. And over the last few months, there have been a number of people in the UK who have been saying quite prominently in the Financial Times and other places that the high street is dead, and that it should be dead, and that we should let it die if it isn't dead already. And I fundamentally disagree with that. And it sounds like we possibly all do. That doesn't mean there aren't things that have to be done, and clearly there are.
Why is it important to save the high street, if at all?
I think that the high street plays a whole number of roles. It plays an economic role, but it also allows people, if you get it right, it allows people to sort of get on the bottom rung of business and retailing in particular. And it's also a place where people meet. It's a kind of beating heart of the centre of a community. And if you get the mix right, and if you have small shops there and small locally owned shops as well as the big places, then you will also reduce crime.
Sorry, what was your reaction, Brian?
Basically, it's really a question, again, I agree with what David said, it's a question of how you do it. What I'm in favour of making it if you like, a commercial solution. It's very easy to help the situation by allowing free access to the space. So there are certain things government could do in terms of, as I say, making it a little easier. But we have to be very careful about the financing of it, distorting an open market, as I believe. There are standards being set by leading-edge major retailers out of town. What we've got to do is see what makes retailing good and somehow give that insight to people operating in the high street, and then make it a little easier for them in terms of access to money, the price of that money in terms of what they cost to borrow it, etc., and just make it, as I say, viable commercially. Then we can all go ahead on a proper foundation. The key is not to take shortcuts with that, but obviously there are huge social and other aspects. But the key is, as I say, to make it something sustainable from a commercial point of view.
And Richard Dodd from the British Retail Consortium, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I mean, a worrying number of shops in our town centres are empty at the moment, and that's been exacerbated by the economic difficulties of the last few years, but it's not exclusively down to that. And we can't just assume that once wider economic recovery happens, as undoubtedly will eventually, we seem to be waiting a long time for it, but when it finally happens, we can't just assume that the problems of our town centres will go away, because a lot of them are more deep-seated than that, and they really are about costs. Business rates is a really important one, rents, and then it's about things like parking and access, and often a failure in many locations over a period of years to have invested in making those town centres into safe and attractive places that people want to go to. So those are the kinds of problems that need to be addressed. Certainly there are issues about where businesses that are looking to start up and occupy those vacant premises are going to get their finance from, but really we need to be thinking about supporting the retailers who are operating right now, and certainly business rates, that tax that all businesses have to pay, but which falls particularly harshly on retailers because they need premises. Apart from online operators, they need premises to sell from. That should be at the absolute top of the list when government is thinking about what it can do.
You mentioned online operators. Surely that is a way for some consumers to get a much better deal than you're going to get on the high street, and it's also a way for businesses to avoid a lot of the costs and the problems you've already mentioned.
Well, online's fantastic, of course it is, and it offers a whole world of choice to customers and all sorts of opportunities for retailers as well. You can exaggerate the role that online is playing in undermining store retailing. At the moment it's about 10%, as you said, it's about 10% of overall retailing. Of course it's growing very rapidly and it'll go on growing, but really the issues in the high street are those that I've just outlined, particularly costs, more than being anything about the growth of online retailing. And in some cases, of course, online can offer opportunities for smaller retailers, the kinds that you might well find in high streets, the independent operators, because particularly they're selling niche products or offering specialist items, then of course suddenly they're opening up a huge potential market for themselves that they don't get just from passing trade.
David Bull, do you think that the internet is undermining the high street?
Well, it isn't yet, but it's very important that we understand the way these things are changing. I mean, I think, if you, let's just look at the book market, for instance. If you know what book you want, then the chances are you'll probably get it online. If you don't know what book you want, you're looking for a present or something, then I personally find that going to a small local bookstore like my own and Crystal Palace, where you can kind of interact with whatever the choices of the manager is probably the best way of doing it. What gets missed out in both of those options is the people in the middle, the Waterstones of this world, which have exactly the same set of books everywhere in the country. And there, I'm not sure what role they play. And I think you can see a similar process going on in a whole lot of different markets. So there's a kind of squeezed middle going on. On the one hand, you have very big, slightly moving towards the monopolistic players, the big four supermarkets, who are attempting to sell everything. On the other hand, you have the small retailers who are providing things that you really can't get anywhere else. It is the people in the middle that have the problem, and that's the solution that has to be solved. I mean, the difficulty is that over a generation or so, we have allowed investors to take too much money out of the high streets. The rents are far too high. We've also allowed these huge, great retailers to build up, which have a semi-monopolistic position, which are undermining the rest of them. And we have to deal with those three problems.
Do you think there is a trouble with online retailers undermining the high street? Because it strikes me that I could, as we posed the question of the book from Waterstones, I can go into Waterstones, but I looked online at a very big online retailer. It was half the price. Surely there's no question there. I can go and have a look on the high street, but I could buy it from Amazon.
Indeed. And taking the book example, we'll also possibly deal with DVDs and CDs. Brings it out very nicely, in fact. If I want to have a book or, if you like, CD, we have to remember shops are there to serve customers' needs. It is not all of our need to actually keep shops going, regrettably. So with that in mind, I go into a bookshop and want a particular title, and they said, fine, if the wholesaler has it, you can have it in 3 weeks. I can go outside with my phone, even in the store if I have the nerve, and actually order it up on Amazon, pay £1 extra and have it in my hands the next morning. That instant gratification is ruling the scene, I would suggest. We then look at books in the same way. If I want to set up as a retail bookseller, I need to have 50,000 titles in a shop. So many, in fact, that it's confusing for those who don't know really what they want. They can go and look at genres, etc., and perhaps explore, and that's a great pleasure. I love wandering around bookshops. But the problem is that how can they sustain the stock implications cost-wise of doing that, service, and basically be able to respond to the impulse requirement of someone coming in. So that's one issue. Another issue, if you take what I mentioned earlier, was the distortion of retailing in this high street, is the question of, for instance, let us say charity shops. If you take charity shops at this moment are in fact the biggest retailers of second-hand books in the country. They get the stock for nothing and basically can resell it at a reasonable price, very reasonable indeed. Our poor classic retail, if you like, bookseller is at a disadvantage there. So that's the type of distortion. But there are social reasons why the charity shop is very important in terms of recycling of goods, giving employment to people who would never get a job normally, and they get some work experience. So that's given, and of course the money goes to a worthy cause, without a doubt. But the problem is, again, we've still got to manage a total high street. The government somehow have to manage that, and using basic principles of, if you like, supply and demand and commercial, if you like, constraints on the whole process can help. That would allow people, as Richard suggested, the government have a rationale for repricing what they have to do to either police a half-empty street, or maybe 15% perhaps, but nevertheless, a cause of potential crime, has to be managed better, has to be kept healthy in the sense of the infrastructure of the stores, in that a vacant shop leaks are not actually noticed until they get to the street, etc. So you've got all of that having to be managed in the normal compromise of government. So I can understand where they're coming from. We have issues, for instance, I would suggest, like the banks, when they are landlords, cannot simply reduce the price because, as you know, a lease as an asset for a bank is based on a multiple of rent. If they then say we'll drop the rent by half, which is a good idea, in practice we've got to reduce the value of that asset in the balance sheet, thereby need some help from all of us in terms of bailing them out again. So you've got that knock-on effect. So it's not straightforward. We need to be careful of potential distortion of natural markets and just watch for the excesses. And then everything, to me, fits into place.
You're nodding your head, Richard.
I think what we should always remember in all of this, and this is true for retailing as a whole, is that it's customers who drive everything that goes on. And if customers are choosing to buy books online because that works for them, then of course we shouldn't be looking to try and halt that or hold back the tide. We should be looking at what we can do then for the overall mix in the high street. And inevitably that will develop, and maybe maybe booksellers and people selling DVDs and CDs, maybe they are the past rather than the future. And it may also be that some of the premises that have been shops in the past in particular towns are not going to be shops in the future, and we've got to look for other business uses preferably, but maybe even think about residential uses for them. But nevertheless, retailing has got to be at the centre of high streets and town centres for the future.
Yeah.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna. Today we're discussing the future of the British High Street. And joining me at the moment is Richard Dodd from the British Retail Consortium, retail consultant Brian Moore, and David Boyle from the New Economics Foundation. You mentioned that this could possibly be the future. Can we ever see a scenario where online or shopping just becomes online? Perhaps technologically, someone can wear glasses, go down a 3D high street, and you get to have the same shopping experience. But then also, you perhaps have clothing stores which just act as big fitting rooms where people can go and try on clothes but order in store online.
Yes.
Does that ever sound plausible to either of you?
It is inevitably the future, without a doubt. The issue is to what extent I still, rather conservatively, would want to feel the pages of a book or try something on and wouldn't trust that decision to be made by a computer. But that said, there will be another 99% of people who will be quite satisfied to go the other way. What we then allow is this natural transition to occur and make sure there's no one abusing the privilege of concentration through pricing and other restraints, etc., and then allow it to mature in that respect. Richard raised an interesting point in terms of making some of the streets more domestic, in a manner of speaking, and I've heard of ideas where local entrepreneurs, developers, etc., have said, right, what we'll do is re-let the space above a shop as domestic, that preserves the tone of the neighbourhood, gives life to it, etc. We can charge a commercial rent for that, allows us to charge less for the guy downstairs, who in fact then is a, if you like, crowd puller to the whole area. And so there's a level of rental there that is practical and viable as far as all are concerned. If government get on the back of that and say, right, okay, we do have 10% of business rates for certain sectors, why not apply that to any deserving retailer where we need that particular outlet type to complement an offering within the area? So it can be manipulated without being forced or becoming uncompetitive for people not so eloquent a voice or requests in that respect.
David Boyle, what are your thoughts?
Yes, but the problem is that it drives out other kinds of formats. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind that we would all be better off if there was a Big Ten rather than the Big Four, and I hope the government acts on that at some point. And I think there is more that we can do to enforce the town centre first. And we have to look at the future, when energy is going to be considerably more expensive, and when the costs of using out-of-town stores and using also the hugely energy-intensive infrastructure that the present distribution systems use is simply not going to work. And you kind of have to leap ahead, I think, for the future a little bit and think about what a low-energy retail system is going to look like. And of course, it will involve a lot more online. But there is always a point where that won't go. I mean, you can't have your hair cut online, for example, that everybody uses. But also, I think there is a kind of, the more people go online, the more they also yearn for something real and authentic. And that's where the high street comes in. And that means a different kind of high street. I agree very much. But I think the high street is the future, really, rather than the out of town.
And there's still a big social and leisure aspect to shopping for a lot of people, which they certainly can't get from, sitting down in the front room in front of a computer.
We've mentioned supermarkets and the kind of role that the Big Four play at the moment. Do you think it's time that we embrace traditional high streets, such as the independent stores, or should we start to accept that the future of the high street might be being run by these big supermarkets?
Indeed, okay. In terms of the big guys, I again criticise them as much as anyone does. There's a natural limit for supermarket development in that usually, and in many countries, a particular retailer's share of more than 25% begins to attract unwelcome attention from the government, the legislation, and various other parties that seem to be abusing farming and every other thing that affects them. So from that point of view,
debate
that type
for
of
another
limit,
day, perhaps.
Well, if you just have to have 4 of them, and you've taken 100% of the market, so we keep going back to the numbers. It's not up. So what Tesco is suffering now because they're up at 30%, and we have been spending a lot of time now fighting a rearguard action against all of these negative pressures. So a natural development. Equally, they've, as most of them have miscalculated the future for a hypermarket or large retail operation, in that they're now so efficient on supply chain they can make 2 facings do the work of 5 with minimal backup stock. So from that point of view, they need to either fill the rest or sublet some of that space in order to make that particular unit viable, but they're locked into something that costs them what could have been 30-40 million pounds and a lifetime of 25 years. So they've got to somehow change and reconfigure that.
Because one of the biggest complaints is people walk down their high street and they say, well, look, all the independent shops is closed, my local greengrocer is closed, my local newsagent has closed, my local butcher's closed, but hey, this big supermarket's opened up offering all the same for half the price.
No, which is totally, basically, if people feel that strongly, why are they prepared to pay 20% extra for the privilege is what one has to ask. And technically, as a retailing operation, a Tesco of this world, but equally Morrison's, certainly Sainsbury's, and as they're capable of being able to do the same thing, can do a very efficient small space. They won't have the commitment and dedication because it's still a bureaucracy being large, etc., and have all those normal problems. If they can crack that, they will begin to populate the high street. So we have to be careful. That's what I'm saying, that basically if the government said, right, if we could accept that these big retailers are big because of what they've done to the science of shopkeeping, they've missed a trick left, right and centre, but nevertheless that's what happened. What we do is help independent retailers to actually do that in their local level and apply those. So that's one, is training them and being able to make it possible for them.
David Boyle, what's your reaction to the kind of takeover of the high street by big supermarkets? Do you think it is a step in the right direction, something we should be embracing?
No, I think it's very damaging. And you've got to distinguish between the kind of supermarket that tries to sell everything and will therefore corrode the local economy, and those which are just trying to bring in other people and which can provide a genuine anchor. And I think I don't think that the local authorities, for instance, have quite grasped the implications of the difference. So that when you have a lot of local independent stores or stores which are trading from each other, and where people, and businesses where allow the money to circulate around the local economy, then that local economy will be a good deal more robust and more independent than one which just has one big supermarket which everybody goes to.
From what we've said so far, it seems the high street is going to play a very big role in the future of retail. If we could just go round all three of you and just give a short prediction of how you see the high street and online panning out, say, in the next decade. I'll start with you, David.
I think there is a great future for High Street, but you do have unrestricted out-of-town shopping and uncompetitive scenarios for the future from some of the very big supermarkets. So I don't agree that you somehow can ignore those things. If you tackle those things, then I think as energy prices increase, and people increasingly want something real to get hold of, and they want to live somewhere real and feel they're part of real places, then I think the high street has a great deal to offer.
Fantastic. And you, Richard, from the British Retail Consortium?
Well, I think you have to remember that high streets have been with us probably for about 2,000 years in this country since the Romans, and they'll be with us for an awful lot longer. But of course, they've developed over the centuries, and they'll go on developing. That's inevitable, and it's actually desirable. And online retailing will go on expanding from that 10% of the market it's got at the moment. Wouldn't it be fantastic if between us we actually knew at what point it'll stop growing? You know, that's a big question, and we don't know the answer. Clearly, it's going to grow further, but there's definitely going to be a significant amount of space for traditional retailing in shops, and much of that will be in town centres. But we can't just assume that's going to happen of its own accord. We need to get in there and help them to thrive.
Great. And Brian?
Yes, indeed. Again, difficult sticking my neck out in the sense of it's 10% at the moment. It's been growing rapidly and will continue to grow to a natural level, whatever that is, where people, as David was suggesting earlier, want to go in and feel the width and the manner of speaking of the clothing, and that's important. I would see 25 to 30% of all retail being online within the next 10, 15 years, okay? And there's nothing one can or should do to stop that. What you then leave is, and you'll have a replication as much as possible. If we were setting up an online version only of retailing, I'd want to then replace the shopping experience, i.e. the need for these people to go in and try something on, and I can do that with virtual clothing, dressing rooms, etc., etc. And there will be some categories where, as I think David said earlier, is the idea of going in having a hair treatment or a haircut, etc. Obviously essential, though I could imagine some sort of mechanical cap on a program being able to achieve that as well. But that again, but that said, we're talking about we want a natural environment. Okay, I'm very, if you like, hair-wise, a little bit, if you like. I won't even say it, okay. Basically, challenge was the word, David, yeah. So from that point of view, I feel strongly about the haircuts. When it comes to, as I say, the natural environment of a high street, it, of course, is a social environment. We need to preserve that, and we will. What we have to be careful of doing is not artificially sustaining it, and taxpayers and other people will have an interest in that formula, if you like, and should be involved in the process. Government will follow ultimately, eventually, what they require. So from that point of view, that's where it'll end up. The question is what it will be like. You're talking about a mix, probably out of town is being challenged at the moment. There is a place for that. If they get the parking right in town on a way that people feel fair, more will be kept in the high street, because I prefer the locality of where I live rather than driving even 4 miles to my nearest hypermarket. So I'd say put money on it. We're talking about a third online, a third in the high street, and a third out of town.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time today. My thanks to my guest, Richard Dodd from the British Retail Consortium, retail consultant Brian Moore, and David Boyle from the New Economics Foundation.